The cold night rains not only cover the small village where Priya lives, but also make the luxurious house she lives in more gloomy and scary. Behind those splendid walls is not the warmth of a family, but a series of cruel crimes that are carefully hidden. Each woman enters here with a dream of a new life, but then they disappear without a trace, leaving haunting stories that spread throughout the village. As the mysteries are gradually revealed through small clues, Priya begins to realize that she may be the next to meet a tragic fate. With little time left to think or hesitate, she knows she must escape this nightmare before she is drawn into a spiral of death. But will the fear, the brutality of her husband's family, and the haunting darkness surrounding the house keep her trapped in this prison forever? Or will Priya have enough courage to run away from the fate that awaits her? Raj, at the age of 40, is the most powerful man in the village. Despite his old age, he still holds all the decisions in his wealthy family and owns a lot of land and property. With a dignified and powerful appearance, he is respected by everyone in the village, but inside he is a cold and cruel person. People look at Raj and see only a successful man, but no one knows the dark secrets hidden behind that facade. Priya, only 19 years old, is an innocent and pure young girl from a poor family. For her parents, marrying Priya to Raj is a salvation for the family from constant poverty. They do not care about the huge age gap between the two, but only see it as the only way for their daughter to have a stable future, and they can escape poverty. However, for Priya, this marriage is no different from a sentence. From the moment she steps into the lavish house, Priya quickly realizes that life with her husband, who is 21 years older than her, is a series of days filled with fear and obsession. Raj not only treats her as a possession but also controls her every move. Her expectations of a good life completely collapse when Priya has to face the brutality of her own husband. No longer the dreams of youth, Priya's life is now immersed in dark secrets, and Raj's presence in her life becomes a ghost that threatens her every day. She gradually realizes that the women who used to live in this house have mysteriously disappeared, and every clue indicates that she may be the next victim. Can Priya escape that dark and powerful house, or will she be forever trapped in a spiral of control and cruelty? Soon after entering married life, Priya realized the bitter truth about Raj. He was not a man she could trust or rely on. Instead of care and protection, Priya had to face coldness and absolute control from her husband. Raj saw her not as a wife, but as a soulless asset for him to control and satisfy his needs for domination. Every word and every action of Priya had to obey Raj's will, and any small resistance was responded to with harsh words or mental abuse. However, the brutality did not stop at Raj. Priya's husband's family, from her mother-in-law to her siblings, all contributed to this control. For them, Priya was no different from a servant, having to obey all the family's requests without having a say. The insults, abuse, and coercion became more and more severe, leaving Priya in a state of confusion and despair. No one stood by her, no one reached out to help. Every day was a tiring mental battle. She gradually lost her sense of self, as if all the values of life had been erased under the curtain of power and tyranny of her husband's family. Priya's life became a long series of dark days, trapped in a cycle of oppression and isolation. All her hopes for a married life that she had dreamed of were crushed. She faced terrible loneliness, abandoned in a lavish house full of cold corners. Not a word of comfort, not a single sympathy. Priya gradually realized that she was not only a victim of her husband, but also of a rotten family system where cruelty and indifference reigned, and she was completely trapped, with no way out within reach. The brutality that Priya had to endure culminated in a terrible night. After a long day of hard work preparing a party for her husband's family, she was exhausted but still could not rest. Instead of recognition, Priya received the cold gaze of her mother-in-law, Mrs. Savita. Every small mistake at work became an excuse for Mrs. Savita to scold and criticize her endlessly. She made no secret of her contempt for her, making Priya feel completely alone in the house. As darkness fell, the atmosphere in the house became more tense than ever. Raj, with a rage that had no reason to flare up, stormed into her room. No words could soothe this cruelty. The blows rained down on Priya's body with such force that she could not resist. Each blow was not only physically painful but also mentally devastating. She was completely overwhelmed, feeling helpless, as if she were just an object to vent her anger. In her panic and pain, Priya clearly felt that she was trapped. Her husband's family was not only indifferent but seemed to be complicit in her torture. Mrs. Savita, despite witnessing everything, remained indifferent, considering it a part of everyday life. No one spoke up to protect or help Priya. The home she entered with the hope of a new life now feels like a prison with no way out. As each day passes, the abuse and violence slowly erodes Priya's soul. Despair replaces all hope, and she understands that she is faced with a life or death choice: either escape this terrifying cycle or be sucked into it forever. Raj's coldness makes Priya more vulnerable to the rest of the family, especially her father-in-law Shankar. With Raj's aloofness, Shankar sees an opportunity to exploit Priya, making her a victim of his dark and evil actions. Raj seems unconcerned with what happens to Priya, completely ignoring the signs of abuse she endures. This only adds to Priya's loneliness and despair, making her feel like nothing more than a puppet controlled by her husband's family, where no one cares about the pain she is going through. In the heavy darkness of the house, the silence was broken only by the steady footsteps of Shankar, Priya's father-in-law. He was an old man, but his power in the family was still terrifying. Raj might be brutal, but Shankar, Priya's father-in-law, was the one who truly made her tremble every time she saw him. There was something in his cold eyes that always made Priya feel that danger was lurking around her, and tonight, that fear would become reality. That night, when the whole house had fallen asleep, Priya felt like she was haunted by a nightmare with no way out. She curled up in her room, her eyes staring blankly at the pitch-black sky. Suddenly, she heard the door open softly but ominously. She felt a chill run down her spine as she saw Shankar's figure pass by the door. He approached her bed, his eyes filled with possessiveness and contempt. Priya felt her heart being squeezed, too scared to move or call for help. Without a word, Shankar reached out and pulled her up. He was not as slow as his old age. On the contrary, he acted with decisiveness and coldness. Priya tried to resist, but her weakness and despair made her powerless. His thin fingers slid over her body with terrifying control, as if he owned her, inhumanely and cruelly. Not a single cry for help escaped Priya's mouth, because she knew that no one would come to her aid, not even Raj or Mrs. Savita. Feeling violated little by little, Priya felt like she had lost all will. All that was left was unimaginable pain and humiliation. Shankar not only treated her as a subordinate, but also treated her as a soulless object without the right to choose. That night, Priya was not only deprived of her freedom, but also her self-respect and belief in life were completely shattered. After the terrible incident ended, Shankar stood up and walked away coldly, as if nothing had happened. He left Priya devastated and devastated. She couldn't cry, couldn't breathe, only feeling empty. From that moment on, Priya knew that she was not only trapped in a hellish marriage, but also trapped by a family filled with terrible darkness. If she didn't find a way to escape this house, Priya would live in hell forever and never be able to return to herself. That night not only marked her physical collapse, but also the loss of all hope for salvation. Everything seemed to have reached its limit for Priya, but then one rainy night, she suddenly discovered a terrible secret. While accidentally passing through the dark hallway, Priya heard the whispering voices between her mother-in-law and a distant relative in the living room. The conversations were broken but clearly centered on a topic that she had long felt was amiss. They were talking about the women who had lived in this house, Raj's previous wives and previous brides in the family, all of whom had died mysteriously. The mother-in-law's words sent a chill down Priya's spine. The mother-in-law did not talk about the accident as the family had told everyone, but instead implied that these deaths were arranged to preserve the family's reputation and power. Priya clearly heard her mother-in-law emphasize that everything was carefully arranged and that no one outside the family had the right to know the truth. A feeling of shock spread through Priya's body as she realized that the women before her had all met a tragic end, and it was all covered up by the immense power of the Raj family. Priya could not help but think that she would meet the same fate if she did not find a way to escape this house. After that terrifying conversation, Priya begins to notice unusual signs in the house: locked rooms, strange objects that no one in the family uses anymore, and old documents containing the stories of previous victims. A frightened servant warns Priya that she could be next if she doesn't leave quickly. Priya's fear grew stronger and stronger. She knew that she was racing against time, and that if she didn't act now, she would not be able to escape the tragic fate that this family had planned. The only question left was whether she could find a way to escape before the deadly trap closed forever. After discovering the horrifying secrets about the mysterious deaths of her previous wives and brides, Priya could not sleep well. Fear haunted her every night. Every action of her husband's family now appeared suspicious, like ghosts haunting them. She knew that if she didn't find out the truth soon, she would also become one of the next victims. One stormy night, when the whole house was asleep, Priya decided that she had to do something. Her intuition told her that the forbidden basement, which was always locked, contained the answers to the mysteries that she needed to know. Heart pounding in her chest, Priya quietly crept down the dark stairs, holding the key she had stolen from her mother-in-law's room. The basement door creaked open, blowing cold, gloomy air into her face like a death warning. Inside the basement, dim lights illuminated the old objects, but what caught Priya's attention was a large, dusty chest in the corner. With trembling fingers, she opened it and discovered the personal belongings of previous victims' bracelets, clothes, and a small box filled with old scraps of paper. Priya flipped through the pages, her eyes widening in horror as she realized they were the diaries of the women who had lived in the house, each page recording their fears, despair, and sudden demise before they disappeared. As Priya read the last lines of a diary, she heard heavy footsteps coming towards the basement. Her heart almost stopped beating. She quickly hid the diary and hurriedly stood up, trying to find a way out, but it was too late. Raj stood in front of the door, his face hard, his eyes flashing with cruelty and coldness. "Do you think you can hide anything?" His voice rang out angrily. The storm outside was still howling, but Raj's voice made Priya shiver. Raj walked towards Priya, and she felt the deadly danger in every step he took. "The people before you also thought they could escape from here, but you saw their fate." Raj's words were like a knife cutting into Priya's mind, making her dizzy. Priya realized she had no other choice. She backed away towards the corner, but Raj was already closing in on her, his hands full of threats. In a panic, Priya accidentally grabbed a large shovel that was nearby. Left with no other choice, she swung it with all her remaining strength, aiming at Raj's head. The blow was so strong that Raj immediately collapsed. Blood from the wound on his head began to flow, seeping into the cold dirt floor of the basement. The rain outside pounded against the window, as if to join the storm inside Priya. The horror she felt as she realized she had just killed her husband in a desperate act of self-defense. After Priya accidentally killed Raj, panic hit her, like a storm that pushed all reason out. Cold sweat ran down her nose, her heart pounding as she heard footsteps coming up the stairs. She knew the truth was about to explode, and there was no time to hesitate. A shiver ran through her. Priya looked around desperately, searching for an escape but saw no safe path. The family members, after discovering Raj's body, rushed into the basement in a panic. Savita, her face full of indignation, was the first to appear. When she saw her son lying motionless, her grief turned into uncontrollable anger. "You killed my son," her scream echoed, making Priya feel crushed under the weight of accusations. Priya was dragged out of the basement and forced to sit on a hard chair in the living room, where all eyes were on her. They not only wanted to know the truth, but also wanted to vent their anger on her. The questions piled up. The criticisms were like knives stabbing into her soul, making Priya feel like she was trapped in a trap with no way out. As time passed, Priya faced relentless beatings and insults from Raj's family. They not only sought revenge for Raj's death, but also sought to silence her. The painful beatings and vicious curses only made her more determined. Priya knew that she could not allow herself to be a victim any longer. That night, as the atmosphere in the house became heavy, Priya decided to take action. Confused but also filled with determination, she began to look for an opportunity to escape. Once the family members had fallen asleep, she moved stealthily through the dark hallways, feeling like every step was a battle with fate. With each passing moment, Priya told herself that she had to find out the truth about Raj's death and the secrets surrounding the family. Her heart was filled with anxiety but also boiling with determination. Despite the dangers that lie ahead, she is determined not to be imprisoned forever. Now, Priya was ready for her fight for survival. She would not only have to face her family's enemies, but also find light in the darkness that had enveloped her life. She was determined to reclaim her life, not only for herself but also for the women who had suffered in silence. With a pounding heart and a rising panic, Priya dashed out of the house where her obsession and fear had trapped her. The pouring rain was like a curtain, but she could not stop to think. As soon as her feet touched the ground outside, Savita's voice called out. "Stop!" The anger in her voice was like a slap in the face, but Priya could only run. Her family members had discovered her disappearance and began to chase her. Priya's rapid breathing mingled with the sound of the rain as she ran through the dark streets determined. Fear drove her, but the power of her desire for freedom made her never look back. When she heard the sound of footsteps behind her, Priya knew they were getting closer. She dashed into a small alley, looking for a place to hide. It felt like every second that passed could lead to a tragic end. If she was caught, all her efforts would be for naught. Luckily, she saw a dense forest ahead. It might be a safer place to hide. She didn't hesitate, rushing into the forest in the hope of finding a place to hide. The dense trees created a natural barrier, keeping her from the eyes of Raj's family. In the forest, Priya felt the silence that surrounded her, but fear was still present. She stopped by a large tree, gasping for breath and listening to the sounds around her. The calls of her family grew more distant, but she knew they wouldn't give up easily. Every little noise made her heart feel like it was about to jump out of her chest. Priya rushed out of the woods, feeling like she had just escaped from a nightmare. The rain was still pouring down, but the air outside brought her a breath of freedom. Behind her, the screams of Raj's family still echoed in her mind, but she couldn't stop. Every step was a battle with her own fear. When she reached a small roadside cafe, the warmth and dim light inside made her feel safer. With no time to rest, she quickly recounted her terrifying story to a middle-aged woman who saw the pain in her eyes and decided to help. After a short while, Priya was taken to the police station. In the interrogation room, the bright light seemed to shine into every corner of her soul. The police officer sat opposite, his eyes focused on every word she spoke. Priya not only opened up about Raj's death, but also exposed the dark secrets that his family had kept hidden for so long. Every word she spoke felt like a part of the truth was slowly being revealed. When she handed the police her phone, the photos and the diary, Priya felt like she was betting everything on this opportunity. The documents were proof of the cruelty she had endured, not only for herself but for the women who had disappeared before her. She knew it was time to break her silence. The investigation was quick, and as the police began to collect evidence from Raj's house, Priya felt her heart lighten. A fire burned within her. She wanted not only to survive, but to expose the crimes that had taken place. She had found the strength to face her past and no longer be a repressed victim. When the police returned with new information, Priya knew her life had turned a new page. The truth was no longer something obscure in the past, but now became the driving force for the fight, not only for her, but for all those who had suffered in silence. Amidst the painful memories, Priya is determined to rise up to become the guardian of the lost souls. The investigators entered Raj's house, the air heavy as a blanket. Flashlights swept across the walls, illuminating hidden corners. They split into groups, each searching separate rooms, determined to uncover long-buried secrets. When they reached a locked door, an investigator stepped forward with a lockpick, a sense of suspense permeating the space. The door creaked open, blowing cold air into their faces, carrying with it the scent of dark secrets. Inside, they found a small room, filled with the personal belongings of previous brides, sparkling bracelets, faded clothes, and old diaries. As they opened each diary, the investigators were drawn into painful stories. The lines recorded the fear and despair of the women who had lived in this house. Each page is a testimony, a plea for justice, and what they read only strengthens their suspicions of the Raj family's cruelty. An investigator finds a scrap of paper that has fallen out of the diary, noting secret meetings and threats that previous brides have faced. This could be a vital clue, he says, as everyone's eyes turn to the page. Tension builds as they realize that this information is not just a personal story, but evidence of a larger conspiracy. Deeper into the house, they discover a hidden chamber filled with old documents, where marriage contracts and papers relating to lives governed by manipulation and oppression are kept. These papers are like a mosaic, clearly showing that everything was prearranged, making the lives of the women pawns in the game of power. As the investigators collect each piece of evidence, they decide to call in additional forces. Each clue they find not only sheds light on Raj's death, but also opens up more brutal aspects of the family. Undeniable crimes begin to emerge, and the investigation becomes a battle not only for the truth but also for justice. The atmosphere in the house changes. Each secret is gradually exposed, turning the place from a symbol of power to a crime scene. With each piece of evidence that came to light, the investigators felt the power of truth gaining ground. Determined not to let the ghosts of the past continue to haunt the living, the courtroom was packed, the air tense as the judge began to read his verdict. The jury has carefully considered all the evidence and testimony from Priya. The crimes committed in Raj's family, including violence, abuse, and assault, cannot be denied. He looked directly at the defendants. Raj, although you are dead, the atrocities you committed have left serious scars. You not only abused Priya, but you also instilled fear in many of your previous brides. Their deaths, although covered up as accidents, were the result of prolonged abuse. He turned to Mr. Shankar, Priya's father-in-law. You, as the head of the family, not only condoned the violent acts of your son, but also directly violated Priya. Your cruel actions contributed to the suffering of many innocent women. For these reasons, you are sentenced to 25 years in prison. The judge's eyes turned to Savita. You, Raj's mother, knew about the violence and abuse in your family, but chose to remain silent. Your complicity enabled these crimes to continue. You are sentenced to 15 years in prison. He continued to look at the other family members. Those of you who witnessed and did not act will also be held accountable. Each of you will receive a sentence of 5 to 10 years in prison, depending on the degree of your participation and complicity in the violence and abuse. Finally, the judge turned to Priya. You acted in self-defense when your life was threatened and you suffered abuse. The court recognizes that your actions were a natural response to an emergency. Therefore, no charges will be brought against you. He banged the gavel, closing the case. The courtroom was filled with emotion, cheers, and sighs of relief from Priya's supporters. Justice had been served, and the truth had finally been revealed. Priya had won not just for herself, but for all victims of domestic violence and abuse in Raj's family. Priya walked out of the court, knowing she had won the fight against violence. With the money from the lawsuit, she decided to open a support center for victims of domestic violence. The center became a haven for women seeking safety and empowerment. She connected with organizations to receive support, building a community that supported each other. Priya was later honored for her efforts. She became a symbol of struggle and hope, not only for herself, but for all who have suffered. Justice has been served, and Priya will continue to fight for others.